Hi, my name is Emily Turpin, and today I'll be talking to you about Egypt, one of Africa's most fascinating countries. Egypt was one of the first civilizations on the earth, starting back in 3000 BC. It has risen and fallen to power several times, and throughout its history, there's a lot that we can learn. Now, Egypt's history is fascinating to study because it was impacted by three major things: its early isolation, its powerful trade location, and finally, its interactions with Christianity and Islam. So starting off with the early isolation, that was twofold. Egypt's isolation early in its history was because of its desert location. Egypt is completely surrounded by desert. Now this might originally seem like a bad geographical feature to have, but it actually benefited Egypt greatly. It kept outside forces from invading Egypt. A lot of the civilizations around that time were constantly fighting each other, and Egypt managed to stay out of that because of its desert location. Egypt also has a major geographical feature in the Nile River. The Nile impacted Egypt's isolation early in its history because they really didn't have much of a need to go anywhere else. Egypt's Nile was its water supply. It fertilized the soil every year during the flood season. So really the Egyptians had no reason to venture outside of their little oasis. Egypt was also impacted by its powerful trade location. This is also twofold. It was impacted by conquest from other nations and being in the middle of power struggles between other countries. So after its early isolation, Egypt managed to venture out a little bit once the world became more connected through trade routes. And in 332 BC, after Egypt had experienced several weak pharaohs, Alexander the Great, the ruler of Macedonia, came and conquered. And in his stead, he put Ptolemy I in charge of Egypt. And this was Egypt's first non-Egyptian pharaoh. The Ptolemies reigned for quite a while. The last one in that line was actually the famous Cleopatra VII. But the Ptolemaic pharaoh line died out when the Romans came and conquered in 30 BC. Asia also had its sights on Egypt for quite a while. In 641 AD, in fact, the region was conquered by Muslims from the Arabian Peninsula. They would later be known as the Mamluks, but this started a long history for Egypt and Islam. In 969, the Fatimids, a rival group of Muslims, had seized Egypt and created what is now the capital, Cairo. Egypt was also impacted by being in the middle of a tug-of-war game between European and Asian powers. Originally, after being conquered by the Muslims, Egypt was conquered yet again by the Ottoman Turks in 1517. They remained sort of autonomous. They only paid taxes to the Ottomans, but they were considered under that empire. However, under the famous Napoleon Bonaparte, in 1798, the French came and conquered Egypt. This was the second time Egypt would be under the rule of a European nation. This led to several back and forths between the Ottomans and European powers until finally Egypt sort of gained control back for itself from the Ottomans, but it didn't last long because Egypt and European governments made this power agreement that they would join forces to create the Suez Canal. However, Egypt didn't really get a good end of this bargain because in 1875, due to severe debts to the British government, Egypt had to sell its portion to the British, and this led to Britain and Egypt not really getting along because Britain and France ended up getting powerful positions in the Egyptian government, and Egypt once again was under foreign control. Now, finally, Christianity and Islam interactions had a huge role in the history of Egypt. Christianity has a long history in Egypt. There's many mentions of Egypt in the Bible, in both the Old and New Testaments. This is where the Israelites were under slavery, and this is where Joseph and Mary fled from Herod with baby Jesus in the New Testament. Not long after Jesus' death, there were several unnamed Christian missionaries that ended up in Egypt. Local Egyptian Christians claim that Mark the Evangelist was the first one to bring the gospel to Egypt. However, that is just based off of tradition. Egypt is home to many of the great early church fathers, including Clement of Alexandria and Origen of Alexandria. And these men had a big part in not only impacting the Christian community in Egypt, but also having a huge role in the Christian church history as a whole. Now, Islam in Egypt is a bit more modern. Like I said before, Muslims have been in Egypt for a very long time, but it is now the official religion of Egypt. 85 to 90% of Egyptians consider themselves Muslim, and Islamic power has really rooted itself in Egyptian politics and power structures and legislature, which is usually the trend of Islamic missions in general. Islam has definitely had a huge impact in the political climate in Egypt and has even played some role in the recent revolutions in Egyptian history. Now, by looking at Egypt's early isolation and powerful trade location and the interactions with Christianity and Islam, it's easy to see how these three factors have impacted Egyptian history. It's important to not just study ancient Egypt history, but also the more current history. There's a lot to be learned from Egyptian history as a whole, and not just by looking at one part of it. Thanks for listening today, and I hope that you learned something about Egyptian history.